So after we've made our basic tweaks, we've let Lightroom decide what it thinks it should do with this photo. Now let's go in and do it for ourselves. So again, I mentioned that I know my camera tends to expose to the left. You can see in the histogram, we've got much more data shifted to the left towards the shadows here versus the highlights. And that's going to end up with a photo that's a little bit underexposed. And on a digital camera, that's actually good because it's a lot harder to get detail back in highlights than it is to get detail back in shadows, just based on the way that digital works. Highlights are more sort of persnickety and difficult to get data back out of. So my camera and many DSLRs are going to expose to the left. You'll get a flat, kind of underexposed looking photo. And we're going to shift this by tweaking the exposure. And it looks kind of dark, and it's probably, again, trying to preserve the highlights that are coming in from this little bit of sunlight. So I'm going to start by bringing the exposure up, and I'm actually going to bring it up about one stop here. So you can see it's going to tell me as I slide the little exposure slider on the right here how far I'm bringing it up. Now, if I bring it up even further, I can easily from the raw format push this up several stops. You see I start to get sort of too much highlights there and blow out some of my highlights. So I'm going to bring it up about a stop. I still am going to have some areas that may be blown out. And the way we're going to check that is, you can see in the histogram, I'm just going to put my cursor over this little triangle on the right, and it's going to show me the clipped areas, the areas that are blown out highlights. And that just means that the white has gone so far up that there's no detail. It's a pure white, and it's not showing any detail in there. So in general, you want to avoid having too much clipping, too many highlights that are blown out. But in this case, I'm looking at where are they. It's going to highlight in red on the actual photo here, the parts that are blown out. Just a little bit of the lettuce here that's in the bright sun, a little bit of the edge of the plate. I'm not too worried about that. A little bit on the tomato there. If I brought this up 2 stops, almost 2 stops here, you can see more of it is starting to be blown out. I'm losing detail in more of the salad here. So I think 1 stop is good. And you just want to adjust. It's a personal preference in some cases. You kind of want to bring it into alignment with what you saw when you were there in the restaurant shooting it. So I'm going to bring it up about 1 stop. Now I can also look at contrast on here too. So if you bring contrast down, we're going to get less kind of difference between the blacks and the whites. It starts to look a little flat, a little bit gray. I don't like to have too contrasty of a photo, so I'm going to bring it up just a little bit there. And we start to get a little bit more contrast between those bright highlights in the sun here and the darker areas in the lettuce on the salad here. So that's our first basic thing, and we're going to make those adjustments to exposure and contrast. Now we can look at the highlights. If I bring, so again we were a little bit blown out on the whites there. I can try to bring the highlights down a bit more. I think Lightroom has correctly brought them down quite a lot already, and I might be able to get a bit of detail back on here by bringing the highlights down further. But really, I don't mind if I've got a little bit blown out on there. So I'm going to keep that about where it is. My shadows, if I bring this down too far, you can see it just becomes sort of a dark mess on there. But I do want to bring up some of the detail. So if you see if this is flat, these shadows, I'm not seeing much in the lettuce here. We lose some of that texture. Now, if I bring those shadows up a bit, you can actually start to see the leaves, the individual elements of that. Especially if we zoom in, we can see those in there. So it's nice to bring the shadows up as long as you're not creating too much, bringing them up so much that we get a very flat kind of composition. Whites can tweak this. This is sort of setting the global level of black and white in the image. I can bring this up a bit. I'm fine with where that one is here. If I bring it down too far, it's going to bring any of those kind of white parts of the images down a bit. What I do like to do, I find that Lightroom keeps the blacks a little bit too high. I like adding a bit more black in, emphasizing that of the image. I think it creates, especially for food photos, a little bit more of that sort of crisp edge around some of the elements of the image. So I'll bring the blacks down a little bit in many cases. You can see the difference. Again, kind of flat, kind of boring. As we add that in, we get a little more drama, a little more contrast, while still keeping the outlines of the individual items in the shadows here. If I bring the blacks down here, and I bring the shadows down, then it just becomes, again, a kind of a black mush, and we don't see any detail. So shadows up, generally good. Blacks down a bit to add that bit of drama and contrast. And now we've got some nice kind of texture to this image, because we've got these highlights that are quite bright. The sun's hitting the candied walnuts in here in a kind of a beautiful way. This tomato's nicely illuminated. We still keep the detail in the shadows here. The blacks that we brought in really start to give the elements here sort of a nice contrast. It keeps this part of the image really highlighted while still keeping the elements of the leaves here that we can actually see in the photo. So I feel good about the exposure settings here. Again, start with your global exposure and contrast, and then make those selective changes to your whites, blacks, shadows, and highlights. Now, one thing to note is, what you're going to do for editing is going to vary by where you're going to be placing this photo. So if you're a professional and you're shooting photos for an editorial context, the most important thing is veracity. So you don't want to make edits to your photos that changes the way that the photo looks, that makes it, inauthentic. So generally the standards there are anything you could do in a traditional darkroom, you can do on your food photo. And, changes to exposure are usually okay, but we just want to keep it relatively minimal. So I don't want to do this and make the blacks, totally dark there. It does add kind of a cool, contrast, and gives it a very distinctive look, but I want it to look more like what it looked like in person. So if I'm going to edit this for an editorial context, for sort of photojournalistic use, then I'm going to just err on the side of making smaller changes here and generally making my changes to the global exposure instead of looking at these individual elements. Another thing to consider is, were you using natural or artificial light? So this was available light. We had this cool little bit of sunlight that came in and created an inadvertent highlight on the image. If you're illuminating your food photos with a flash, if you're using a more uniform light source, I actually like to use a little battery-powered light that'll carry into restaurants and illuminate my dish. If it's dark in the restaurant, then you probably have a more balanced exposure, and you might need to make fewer tweaks to the shadows and whites and blacks and highlights here. Because we had this little bit of sunshine peeking in, we had this very kind of overexposed area, and we need to balance keeping that from getting blown out with still keeping the shadow detail. And again, I'm pretty happy with how that looks here. Just experiment with your own photos until you get the exposure just right.